today. So each presentation will be 15 minutes and followed by a 4-minute discussion and a 10-minute question and answer session. Even though we are 3 presenters, we will stick to the given guidelines so that at the end of our session, you can choose to go to a 4th discussion elsewhere if you choose to. So first up is Ervin Prifti from Food and Agricultural Organization, who will be talking about the cash transfers in Zambia. So over to you.
Okay, thank you. So this talk is going to be about effects of cash transfers on labor supply, adult labor supply. It is not a new topic, but we try to look at it from a new angle. The issue we're trying to address here is how does labor supply react to increases in the amount of cash that households receive. So the treatment is continuous and instead of being just binary. While this may be novel, we need to worry also if it is interesting. Well, from a policy perspective, governments that are currently running cash transfer programs may be interested in whether they are giving too little or too much money to households in order to receive achieve a certain result. Or better yet, they might be interested in whether there is an optimal transfer size that allows to maximize a desirable outcome, in this case, labor supply. Unconditional cash transfers are primarily aimed at reducing poverty, but they can also have productive impacts because at the end of the day, they are a stable source of liquidity that can be used to buy agricultural inputs such as seeds, fertilizers, or rent machinery, and hiring more labor, and also increase household labor supply on farm. So this is what this paper is about. But first of all, let me take one step back and quickly walk you through the main points of this presentation. First, the big picture on social protection, some more motivation of the paper, a quick review of the child grant program in Zambia, the empirical strategy, and then I'm going to share with you the main findings of this paper. So background, social protection, as you know, has come to play an important role in the development agenda. It is an important component of food security and poverty reduction. The FAO is increasingly involved in this process, and this paper is part of the broader series of papers conducted at the P2P team, which is From Protection to Production project of the FAO, and we are mainly involved in the construction of an evidence base to inform policy decisions on social protection in sub-Saharan Africa. So motivation of this paper, why should we be interested? So as I said, unconditional cash transfer has become an important instrument of social protection policy. And now they have, in the last 10 years or so, they have increased by more than 10 times and involve more than are currently implemented in more than 40 countries in Africa. So while they are primarily aimed at reducing poverty and providing relief from deprivation, they can also have productive impacts, as I said before. So, and the governments are interested in whether they do or do not have productive impacts. So supporters of these cash transfers argue that they can offer leg up to the poorest and most vulnerable households and enable their involvement in the economic growth process. While critics sustain that cash transfers, in fact, can reduce work incentives, stifle economic initiative, and create, in the end, a culture of dependency on public money. So this is the issue of dependency here is actually a very big issue among governments that are running cash transfer programs in Africa. Now, from an economic theory point of view, why should cash given to households affect labor supply anyway? So first of all, this is an increase in unearned income. It causes a loosening of the household budget constraint, and if leisure is a normal good, more income leads to more demand for leisure, and as a result, less labor supply. But this is one part of the story. It can also be that cash transfer help overcome labor market imperfections. So there may be households that are that are selling less labor than would be desirable or optimal to them, because there may be fixed costs to work, such as commuting or lack of resources to send children to daycare, and one household member is stuck at home taking care of children. In that case, cash transfers help a household overcome this labor market imperfection and increase labor supply. But it can also be the case that cash transfers can contribute to labor reallocation from paid off-farm labor to on-farm labor. So households that are credit constrained may be selling more labor that would be otherwise optimal to them, just to get liquidity and meet their consumption and investment needs. In this case, cash transfers help households ease the credit constraint and use the liquidity provided by the program to meet investment needs, buy agricultural inputs and work more on the farm. In the latter case, we'd have a shift from paid off-farm labor to own farm labor. And since from a theoretical point of view, it is not clear how cash transfer may influence labor supply, it becomes an empirical issue. So this is why we're looking into this. So big debate in developed economies, cash transfer were in the developed world are known as handouts. They were introduced in the United States in the mid-70s after the negative income tax program, and the empirical literature documented very negative effects on work incentives there. In the developing world, in Latin America, conditional cash transfers are known to have no effects on labor supply, except for the case of Nicaragua, where some studies have found a modest reduction in time spent working for males and for females in Brazil. In Africa, some studies have found labor reallocation from paid labor to on-farm labor, as Daidon et al., but also who studies the very same program that I'm studying in my paper. And Asfaf et al., they studied Kenya's CTOVC program, and they too found some labor reallocation. Gilligan et al. Find no disincentive effects on labor supply, and this other study from Artington, they find positive effects of South African old age pension program. So in the empirical literature, results are mixed, but all these studies, they use a binary tuning approach. The novelty of this study is that we use a continuous tuning approach and see whether the labor supply changes with the amount of cash received by households. So the CGP program in Zambia, very quickly, it was started in 2012. Data are from is a longitudinal randomized controlled trial, baseline in 2010 and a follow-up in 2012. Sample was selected with a two-step randomization procedure at the community level and also at the household level. Now the amount given to the households was supposed to be flat at 60 kwachas per month, which is about 1/4 of households' monthly consumption expenditure. But we do observe some variability in the transfer that households declare to have received. This is the probability distribution function of cash transfers that households receive in 12 months preceding follow-up. So our treatment variable is total cash received in the year through follow-up data collection. As you can see, there is variability. The average cash transfer is 640, is even below the theoretical amount that they were supposed to receive, which is 720, standard deviation of 170. So why do we observe variability in the amount of cash received, even though it was supposed to be flat? Well, missed payments, either from the beneficiary side or from the program implementer side. Also, there were some households reporting that they had received more than the theoretical amount foreseen by the program. So Either way, we are assuming that the variability is due to random factors that are not related to unobserved determinants of labor supply, which is the same as saying that the treatment is exogenous and households are as good as randomly assigned to each treatment level. So this is a descriptive picture of the relationship between our outcome variables and the treatment variables. Our two main outcome variables are total number of days per week worked by all adult household members in paid off-farm work and on-farm work. So in the first column, in the horizontal axis, we split the sample by quantiles of the treatment level, and in the vertical axis, we have the average outcome at each quantile. So as you can see, average outcome for the controls here, which is the first columns, is always above average outcome for the treated, regardless of the treatment level, which is the same as saying that cash transfers here are associated with a reduction in paid labor. While here, the average outcome for the controls is always below average outcome for the treated, which means that cash transfers are associated with an increase in on-farm labor. Here there is no discernible pattern of average outcome. Well, here we can see an inverse U relationship, which is like saying that the average outcome increases with cash transfers up to some critical level, and then it starts decreasing. But this is only descriptive because here we are not controlling for any axis, no regressions, it's just averages, unconditional averages. So these are the controls. In our analysis, there are only three covariates that are unbalanced between the treated and controls, and mostly the randomization procedure is shown to have worked pretty well in the case of Zambia. Now, very quickly, the empirical strategy. This is a continuous treatment approach, as I said. Here, T with I is treatment level. Instead of having only two values, 0 and 1, it can take values in a general interval J, and there can be potentially an infinite number of values. So the parameter of interest is the average treatment effect for those treated at some treatment level J. So there's an error here. Here is supposed to be 0 and not J. So how do you identify that? By taking the difference between the average outcome for those treated at a certain level of treatment J with the average outcome of the controls had they been treated with the same level of treatment J. In order to identify the second part, you need the conditional mean independence assumption, which for the continuous case is just a generalization of the binary case. Now, to the estimating equation, this is just a linear regression, where the effects are identified by first fitting a general function of y on the treatment and of y on the controls as a whole, taking the difference point-wise, and then you have a point-wise effect for each treatment level. So the thing is that we do not, in fact, households were not randomly assigned to each treatment level. So we are just assuming the conditional mean independence assumption. But in the continuous treatment approach, there's no real way to go to assess the validity of the CMIA. So this is why we adopt the doubly robust estimation, which requires the specification of a generalized propensity score. And by reweighting data, everything boils down to weighted least squares, and reweighting by this GPS creates a pseudo population where the treatment is orthogonal to the axis, to the observed characteristics. And by the doubly robust really means that if one of the two models, the GPS or the outcome model, is correctly specified, then coefficient estimates in the outcome model are consistent. So it offers a double protection from misspecification in functional form and in the identification assumption. So results very quickly. So these are point-wise effects for each treatment level. The green part is statistically significant and the red part is not statistically significant. So this is paid off-farm labor and this is on-farm labor. As you can see, average outcome for the treated are always below, as I said, average outcome for the controls. This causes negative effects regardless of the treatment amount. Here is the treatment amount. So the effects are always negative, they're always flat, and significant for very low treatment levels. On the on-farm picture, here effects are always positive and clearly increasing, but they are significant for very large treatment levels. This is 1,000 quachas, and which is even more than the theoretical maximum amount that households were supposed to receive during 1 year. So it would look like it's different households that are switching from paid labor to on-farm labor. But if you look at if you split the sample by dependency ratio, here is non-labor constraint, here is labor constraint, you can see that it's actually the same households that are moving from paid labor to on-farm labor, from paid labor to on-farm labor. Here for very large transfer sizes, here is for very small transfer sizes. Why this is happening? Well, because paid labor in the rural African context means Ganyo labor, which is the least desirable kind of labor, because it's villages working for other villagers for very low wages. So as soon as they have the chance to quit that sort of work, they switch to on-farm work. This is what cash transfers are doing in the case of Zambia, labor reallocation. And it works differently for different households. I mean, for non-labor constrained, they have excess labor, but they need some cash in order to mobilize that excess labor. So this is why we see effects only at very high levels of transfers, because in order to mobilize that excess labor, you need money to buy, agricultural inputs and everything. We're still thinking about why we see effects at very low transfer levels for the labor constraint. Labor constraint in the case of Zambia means that they have a lot of children, because the program targeted households with children under 5, with a lot of children under 5. So this is a puzzle in this paper, and we're still thinking about it. Why effects are significant at low treatment levels for those that are labor constrained. These are the outcomes for hired labor, and here is the same pattern. Those that are non-labor constrained, for them we observe effects at very high treatment levels. For the labor constrained, effects are significant at very low treatment levels. Same pattern. So this I already said, and I'll leave it there because I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ervin, for that nice presentation. Something that I really liked about your paper is that you try to go beyond this binary treatment effects to something of a more gradient by incorporating the treatment levels as opposed to just a 0, 1 variable. And the first comment, I have a couple of comments for you. The first one itself, okay. The first comment itself is about the randomness of this treatment level, because I can see that the treatment, so whether the household gets the cash transfer or not is randomized, and you go into great detail to describe how that is achieved. However, the treatment level, exact amount of money that the households get is not purposefully randomized, and you you assume that it is totally uncorrelated with the unobservables, which might as well be true, but then again it doesn't necessarily have to be. So I suppose from the reader's point of view, a potential remedy could be some sort of a co-weighted balance among the different treatment levels using the pre-treatment data to make sure that there is no pre-existing patterns. If it is, just to make sure that the treatment levels that you are using, which is the core of your study, is in fact randomly assigned. Then, okay, so my knowledge of Zambia is next to nothing, so this could just be me, but how big a transfer are we talking about? You do mention that it's about 25% of the consumption expenditure. So how would that relate to the total expenditure or total income, for example, or what's average income like? So I think it would help the readers put the things in perspective as a minor note. Couple of other things. So you observe that the respondents switching from off-farm labor to on-farm labor. I wonder how that affects the actual labor productivity in terms that they spend more time on their own farm. Does that mean they actually produce much more than they used to? And if they do, is it simply consumption smoothing, or does that production actually lead to some sort of gains in income, or how would that relate to the revenue? So it would be nice to know a little bit more about what is actually happening in the farm when they are working in their own farm. And a minor comment, that is, I noticed that the respondents are eligible to participate in the program if they have, the moment they have a newborn child. So I wonder whether the program has some kind of effect on fertility behavior of the respondents. I don't know if you can do anything about it, but I was thinking, what if people would opt to have children more, thereby becoming the labor constrained households that you are talking about, because they want to be eligible for the program. So these are my comments. Really nice presentation. So you can take some time now to address these comments, and then maybe we can go for the Q&A, or do you want to go for Q&A right away? Right. So yes.
Magnitude comment. Oh, thank you. Yeah. So how does you're saying that the hired labor is going up?
Hired labor?
Yeah. So they hire more labor.
Yeah.
How does this compare to the initial drop in labor supply that you measured? The effect of own wage labor that's going down, and how does it?
Sorry, say again. Sorry.
No, I was just wondering what the magnitude was of them hiring more labor.
Mm-hmm. So they are hiring more labor, the households. The magnitude is much larger for hired labor than for own labor and for paid off-farm labor. Those that I showed are elasticities, so it's percentage changes compared to average outcome at baseline. So
sorry, let me refer. So how do you so they work more on their own farm and they hire more people?
Yeah, yes.
So what's going on the farm? I guess it's another.
They're what?
What's going on in the farm?
Oh, increased productive activities. That's the one way to look at it. Work more yourself and hire more people. There's no substitution there. As you can see, it's complementary. I mean, hired labor and own labor are complementary in this case, not substitutable. This is the economic way to interpret this result. Complementarity of hired labor and own labor.
Any other questions? Yes, right behind you.
Actually, I'm not sure if it's a question or something I simply haven't understood, but the transfer is their own reported transfer they get. It's not an objective measure. Did I get that right?
Self-reported, yes.
It's self-reported. So, and you say that some people even report something which is higher
yes.
than what they in
yes.
fact could get.
Yes.
So the further away you're kind of from what you should get is to a certain extent a measure maybe of, I don't know, education or stuff like that. That's like the less educated you are, probably the more you misreport or something like that. Could that play into there? But I haven't thought it through what then it would have.
I haven't thought of that. I mean, it might be, but yeah, well, I can look into that. If there is any association between average years of education in the household and the amount they report. But you would have to look at misreporting rather than how much they report, I guess. That is something that we don't really know, because we don't have administrative data of how much these people actually receive from the program. We don't know that. But yes, I can look into that, how education is related to the amount of cash reported.
Okay, thank you.
Sam, I think you can just talk because, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, can you guys hear me? Yeah. So along the same lines, I mean, it does seem like you have a big concern here that your variation is being driven by misreporting rather than by actual received transfers. And that's putting aside the issue of endogeneity of kind of who's getting how much of a transfer, right? And how much leakage is taking place for different groups. So another way, you have consumption information, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, just doing a sort of sanity check and looking at how consumption is related to the size of the transfer, because you said this is a pretty sizable transfer relative to their overall
Yes.
level of consumption.
Yes.
So we should see a pretty nice increasing relationship. I mean,
Okay.
I know that we're interested in what's happening beyond the transfer, and so it's possible that these transfers are affecting non-transfer income in different ways, but we just, as a sanity check, you just look and see if there's a nice strong relationship between how much they're reporting getting and their overall level of consumption.
That would be very useful, I guess, yes.
Okay, so if you have more questions, we could, have afterwards. Yeah.
Okay, very well.
So great. So let's have Sam Asher from Oxford University talking about the road constructions and employment opportunities in India.
That worked. Is this working? Yes.
Yeah.
Great. All right, I just wanted to see, can you guys hear me if I don't use the microphone? Because the microphone, the sound is pretty muddy, but I'll use it if we need to. This works? Back? Great. Okay. So thanks everyone for coming today. My name is Sam Asher. I'm here at Oxford as a postdoc, and this is joint work with Paul Novosad, who is at Dartmouth College. College there. And this is part of a larger agenda that we have on trying to explain determinants of local development in India. So this is one of the factors, the quality of infrastructure in rural areas, that we're particularly interested in. So, this is a development conference, so I probably don't need to motivate this question too well. We've all spent time on pretty terrible roads in various countries. This is a pretty good metaphor for this research, because it has been stuck for a while due to a lack of data, but I'm glad to report that it's moving again. Maybe you can turn off that one. Put the one on the table. Oh, that's a very good idea. Thank you. Any suggestions as to how I turn off this mic? How about that? Habitation. Okay. But I'm glad to report that it's moving again, and so today we'll be talking about some preliminary results, and I'll be talking about the direction that this paper is going in. But I should just point out that this is in fact a paved road, so by the standards of rural India, this is actually a pretty good road. And we're going to be talking about places that are going from no roads at all to getting paved roads. But to make the motivation a little bit more formal, the World Bank spends more money on transportation infrastructure than on all of their social service programs combined, education, health. And the Mount Venables and various other papers have shown that poor infrastructure helps to account for very low levels of trade between countries. We're now learning more about how it accounts for low levels of trade and economic activity within countries. Recent years have seen this explosion of research on the role of transportation infrastructure in regional development, largely focused on what's often call trunk infrastructure, railroads, large highways, and that sort of thing. The fact is that the majority of poor and many developing countries live in rural areas, and it's not clear that large infrastructure 100 kilometers away does that much good for them. And so what we want to think about is, well, what's the role of rural infrastructure in connecting them to markets, to the outside world, both for services, and we're not going to be able to answer that very well, but also for economic buying and selling. And there's very little research on the role of rural roads. I'll talk about what little there is. So our question is going to be, what's the impact of these village feeder roads? Think of small roads that connect the village to either a nearby town or to a larger road, on local economic activity and on actual poverty. You're not going to have any poverty results today, but that's where this paper is going. The context is this massive rural road construction program in India. It's called the PMGSY. It means the Prime Minister's Village Road Program. And so that's the term PMGSY I'll be using over and over again. Over the last 15 years, they've built over 100,000 new roads. And where our identification is going to come from is going to be from various program rules that we take advantage of to give us the natural experimental variation in which villages are listed. This is a big concern in various programs, but particularly in infrastructure, because these are very expensive projects that a lot of places think are going to have quite large local effects, and therefore there's going to be a lot of local competition over who exactly gets these roads. So we're going to have to take advantage of these program rules to give us some exogenous variation in the treatment of road. Our data are going to come from a series of different censuses. The challenge with this sort of project is that because the variation is at the village level, you need outcomes at the village level as well. And the vast majority of surveys are at the district level or the state level or something higher. So you're not going to have data at the level of treatment. What our preliminary results are suggesting is quite a large increase in non-farm economic activity. And what we'll be doing as sort of next steps is following up and seeing the effect on poverty, as well as going deeper into what those non-farm economic activities really are. There we go. So I think I've explained all of this, and I'll get into a bit more of that later. So let me just explain a little more about this program. So it was launched in 2000. It took a few years to get going. I'll show you a graph on how it kind of ramped up slowly. But by 2011, we had 80,000 habitations connected, almost 200,000 kilometers of new roads, 130,000 kilometers of upgraded roads, over $150 billion dispersed. So this is a massive, massive program. I should just put this into context. India has 600,000 villages. So this is, and as I said at the beginning, 33 of which, by the census of 2001, were not connected by a paved road. We actually think that was an underestimate, because what the census considers a paved road is pretty generous. It's funded centrally, but administration is conducted by the states and even kicked down to the districts, which is the sort of sub-state level. Think of that as like a county in the US or the UK. What's very nice for researchers is that there's this transparent, systematic electronic record keeping. There's an online website that displays information on every single road that's been constructed, in fact, every contract. And what we did is we scraped all of this data on all of the roads that are constructed. It doesn't have outcome data, but this is what gives us our information on the treatment of this program. I should comment that we scraped this even though we got access, we were granted access by the government of the administrative data itself. It just ended up being easier to grab it ourselves from the internet and to actually get what we wanted from these guys. And there are many objective eligibility rules, which, unsurprisingly, were not followed exactly perfectly, but do give us variation in which villages receive these roads. And so the major one I'm going to be talking about today is that successive rounds were targeted to unconnected habitations with populations over 1,000, then those 500 to 999 populations, then 250 to 499. And this creates discontinuities in the probability of treatment at 500 and 1,000 we're going to be taking advantage. But it's also true that districts implement using a list that's sorted by habitation population, and therefore we're going to use the population's rank of locations within a district after controlling complexity of the population can be used as another instrument. And we're working very closely with the government to determine exactly what rules will follow where. Because unsurprisingly, different places decided to implement this program in slightly different ways. It is a federal system, and so often states and even districts have some discretion as to how to implement the program. So here's a graph of sanctioning on the top and treatment on the bottom by year. So basically you see a lot of roads get sanctioned right away, over 5,000 per year, but it takes a few years to start completing roads. And really the program sort of hits its stride in the second half of the 2000s. And so starting at about 2005, you have nearly 5,000 and then going all the way up to about 10,000 roads per year being constructed. I think I've motivated why we think this is sort of interesting. India has a road density of about 1/10 of the United States, spends about 10% of GDP on physical infrastructure. Many people think the effects of rural roads are quite large, and so if you look in the literature, most papers sort of say, we presume that the effect of rural roads are quite large, and the papers that do exist on rural roads largely don't worry too much about autonomy and find quite large effects. The problem is, of course, that you have significant treatment, selection into treatment, precisely because these things are so attractive for local governments. And it's not clear, actually, at the end of the day, whether a rural road, despite being a major investment, is going to be sufficient to generate local growth. If production is some sort of O-ring production function or otherwise depends on various other complementary inputs, a road alone may not be enough to generate significant population. As I said, there's a lot of work that's been done recently on highways and railroads, very little work on rural roads. There's a nice paper from Sierra Leone by Kasabori and Surrey, where they use rural road program funded by the EU to look at agricultural prices and try to estimate a model of agricultural trade and the behavior of intermediaries. But very little done on rural poverty and the actual effects in the villages of these roads. So our angle is going to be looking actually at rural economic activity that takes place in the villages that are receiving these roads. As I said, we have village level outcomes, which is quite rare across a very large space. We have firm level data from this economic census, which is going to allow us to look at structural transformation. We'll look at the rise of the non-farm sector as they receive roads. We have many details on non-farm employment from these economic censuses in 98 and 2005. The challenge with using these data, this economic census, is that we only have outcomes from the first 5 years of the program, and as I showed you, the program really kind of gets going after 2005. So that gives us limited power in the first half of the program. But what we're going to be doing is bringing in this poverty census later on, which is from 2011, which allows us to take advantage of the first 11 years. Just to be very, very clear, what we don't have is anything with a rupee value. So no wages, no output, nothing that would allow us to estimate, say, productivity. People often ask this question. Can you guys look at productivity? Can you look at what happens to wages? Can you look at what happens to local prices? Because now transportation costs have come down. We'd love to be able to do this. We just as I said, we're going to use these multiple identification strategies to overcome what we think are pretty serious selection issues in who receives roads. And significant work has been done, particularly in the Indian context, to show how much selection there is into the receipt of various infrastructure programs. So we can look at the total population, and so we can think about sort of net migration. There's going to be some effect of fertility that we think we can control for, and mortality, but we are able to look at total population in these villages. As a preview, we don't find anything. But that's, as some very nice work has shown, temporary migration is a very big deal in India, and all that the census is going to be accounting for is who actually reports being based in the village. So even if there's not a lot of time outside of the village working, we can't. Okay. Yes? We're going to use the economic census. Let me just see it. Let me get right to that. As I said, the treatment is going to come from the program itself, the official PMGSY administrative data. Our outcomes are going to come from 3 different censuses. So the economic census, which we have from 1990, 98, 2005, is a complete enumeration of every economic establishment. That means formal and not formal, government enterprises, private enterprises. They knock on every door just like a demographic census would and say what's being produced here instead of
You have 5.
5 minutes. And what we do is we aggregate that up to the village industry level. This is all firm level data. 2005, there were 42 million firms, but treatment different sets of village levels. So we aggregate up these firms. What we know about them is basically the industry they're in and how many workers they employ. So size and have a sense of industry. Everything. Everything. Because they're just knocking on doors. In fact, that's one of the questions is, do you have a premise around, like, are you in a village? I don't think they're doing a great job of picking up vegetable sellers on the side of the road, but theoretically they are. And in fact, what we observe is the vast majority of firms, particularly in rural areas, are one and two. So what we're going to be able to look at is growth in non-farm employment between 1998 and 2005 by looking at the change in employment reported by these economic centers. We also have, again, as I said, we have firm size, we have various other characteristics of these. The characteristics of the owner of the establishment, what sort of power they use, not clear the quality of these other variables, so we're just reporting for now. We'll be able to use the population census as well, which categorizes workers into some different ways, as well as collecting basic information on some assets and other things. Again, at the rural level. And finally, we are using this poverty census, which is, again, an enumeration, every household, every individual in India, and asking various questions about asset poverty at the household level, as well as reporting everybody's education level and other basic characteristics. Okay. As I said, we're using the economic census to look at total non-farm employment, so we can also estimate firm size and some other characteristics of non-farm economic activity in the village. The population census of 2011 gives us more power because we were able to take advantage of the proper implementation of the program in 2005. And we're able to then investigate lags. No results on that today, but we will be able to soon, as well as what I call net migration. And the census itself measures employment in agriculture. We don't think very well, but unlike the economic census, gives us some sense of the ratio of workers in the ag and and as I said, this poverty census data, we're still in processing it, so we're not going to have results from that today. But the idea is that it contains individual information on education, occupation, age, gender, disability, as well as household level data on assets, available and agricultural. So there's massive manipulation in this program. I told you we're going to be doing an RD. The danger to an RD is that there's manipulation of the running variable, and in fact, we see exactly what we don't want to see when you're doing regression discontinuity. I teach regression discontinuity in my class this year, and I think this is about the nicest way that you can demonstrate what you don't want to see, and why you might want to give up on a project if you see this for an RD. But what we were able to get was a different survey of habitation populations that were not used by this ministry and were not used in this program. And we do recurrent tests to show that density doesn't jump significantly around. So the sample is going to be, for the purposes now, every village that did not have a road at the baseline of the program. So some of these roads are upgrades, but we're really interested in what happens when you build a brand new road into a village that didn't have a road. And we're going to restrict it to states where we think our habitation population registers make a lot of sense. Let me just skip past that because we have limited time and get right into it. So if we look at the OLS, we see that a new road before 2005 is associated with very high, large increases in employment growth, about 10% larger employment growth between 1998 and 2005 in villages that do get these roads compared to our control group villages. Don't have roads and don't get them. But as you throw in more controls, that number comes down. It stays significant. We have quite a large sample, but it comes down. Thinking that there is, in fact, suggesting that there is, in fact, quite a large selection into this program. So then, this just demonstrates that basically many village characteristics are correlated with again suggesting selection. Using this within district population rank, we can show that villages that have a higher or lower rank, that are higher up on the list of villages within the district, are much more likely to get villages that are lower down the list. And this is true even after controlling all kinds of village characteristics and for the population. And so this is the first stage using this district population rank. And what we find is basically no effect on population of being treated in this program, but quite significant effects on the proportion of workers. How many people are reporting being actually employed in the census. We can use regression discontinuity to basically give us very similar results. Here's a plot of the residuals after controlling for all of the village characteristics that we use. What's the probability of getting treated with a road? And what you can see is we have these quite large jumps at 500 and 1,000. And what we find again is that there's no real significant change in population, so what we're calling net migration. That's a bit more complicated mortality. But we do find this increase in proportion of people being reported as workers. So let me just talk 1 minute about next steps and then get out of here. So now we have kind of established these basic facts that we're seeing an increase in village level employment. What does this mean? We really want to know where to go from here, because this isn't that interesting. You build a road, you get more reporting work. So there are a few directions that we could take this in. One is in the direction of spillovers. We don't think that the village receiving the road is the only village that's actually being treated by these roads. Nearby villages, both those that are connected and unconnected, are also being treated, either by being better connected to this particular village or having to compete with this. And so we'll look at spillovers to nearby villages. Number 2 is to look at complementarities between trunk infrastructure, large highways, and these rural roads. Trade-off faced by every government is we have a certain amount of money to put into infrastructure. We put it more into these large roads or into these small roads. So hopefully this research will shed some light on that. And then third is we're going to be able to use this poverty census to look at actual impact on poverty within the village. And not just the average treatment effect, but really we'll be able to look into the distribution of poverty within the village, because we have household poverty for every single household in every single village. And I guess I'll leave you there, so more coming soon. Thank you.
So, Ervin, do you want to start? Yeah.
So, very good paper, very well thought, thought-provoking exercise, and it's a very interesting topic. What is the effect of infrastructure on development and employment in this particular case? But it's usually hard. It's hard to measure. How do you measure the effect of building infrastructure on any possible development outcome? And they find very significant results of road building on employment in rural India. So I structured this discussion as a very brief refugee report. So I already summarized the paper, and one thing I want to stress is a very well thought identification strategy. They make use of all information is there to identify the effect, both in terms both using RD and instrumental variables. So in detail, I find it is very well written, but so I will only give some suggestions as to make it better and more robust. So I like to see more robustness checks and falsification tests for the RD part. So while you did density discontinuities for the running variables, I'd like to see the same thing for if there are discontinuities around the threshold for all other controls. So you mentioned that this is a crucial identifying assumption, and there are also some checks can be done there too. I know you did try with differently sized windows, but if I were a referee, I'd also like to see the results for different windows, at least one other window. So I'd also like to see more diagnostics for the IV part, both for the first stage and the second stage. So here the main concern is endogeneity. I'd like to see a Hausmann test, also weak instrument statistics like Angst-Spischke procedure or the Kleibergen-Papp test would help make the whole thing more credible and more robust. And there are signs of possible persisting treatment heterogeneity, as I see it. So impacts do vary considerably between methods. 26.4% in RD, 8.7%, and that can be good because different methods should produce similar results, let's say. Then first stage IV coefficients for the 2005 exercise, they are significant but are not very large. But also for the 2011 exercise, if here they are using population rank of the village inside the district as an instrument for having a road built. So if the village was to move counterfactually 100 ranks up, this would produce a 1.5 months increase in exposure to treatment, because treatment in the case of IV, as I understood, is not binary, is continuous. And this brings about 8.7% in the number of employed people. So I saw that treatment is different. So that must be one of the reasons that you have different magnitudes in RD and in IV. So in RD it is binary, while for instrumental variables it is continuous. It might be an idea using also for IV a binary treatment just for the sake of comparison and to see what's happening there. Also, I noted that in the text of the paper, the outcome variable is defined as log employment growth in equation 1, where you do OLS, and log employment in equation 3 and 4, where you do RD and IV. I wonder if there is a reason for the change in the definition of the Y, or also last thing, I'd also like to see some subgroup analysis and based on observed village characteristics, so just to see how heterogeneous the effects are and what is driving the effects. If we can pin down some channels for these effects. That's all. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. I've been told that I need to have my microphone on in order for the video to hear me. So unfortunately, the video is going to be completely mute, which some people may appreciate. Let me just respond to those quickly, and then I'll take a few questions. So on the results varying by method, what you said later was exactly right, which is that, and that this is my sloppiness in the current version of the paper. We define treatment slightly differently. We define treatment in one set of results based on just a binary variable, which is did you receive a road or not. In another place in the paper, we define treatment in terms of how many years, because we're interested in treatment intensity, and we think that with these sort of investments, it's going to take a while for people to adjust, new businesses to start, seek out new economic opportunities, et cetera. So that sort of, it actually explains quite nicely the different estimates of employment growth between the two, because on average, you've had about 3 years of a road in the treatment group, and the effect for the binary is about 3 times the annual effect. So it's suggesting linear treatment effects right now, but we absolutely want to go into a lot more of how these results are varying over time, and whether there's sort of a steady state after a few years or not. But I completely agree with your feedback. As we take this paper forward, we want to do a lot more robustness on both the first and second stages. And as I said at the end of my presentation, I think one of the really interesting areas, apart from the spillovers, is going to be the subgroup analysis. So sort of what villages are really able to take advantage of this new piece of infrastructure to grow economically, and in what ways. One thing that I should say that we're sort of finding right now is a complementarity between roads and electricity. So effects in villages that have electrification already. So with that, I think that pretty much addressed it, but thank you very much. Those were helpful comments. Other questions? I guess we're supposed to use the microphone so that the video can hear it.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentation. I really liked it, and I think we all agree roads are really important. I was a little, you just addressed it a little bit, but I'm a little concerned about the fact that this is part of a larger program. So I know that it's part of NREGA, so the local people are the ones, I believe, working on the roads. And there's also drainage issues, and then I think it was complementary to, as you just said, the electrification. So I know you're controlling for that, but I just kind of worry about like how can we separate the road effect from all these other things that are going on at the same time.
Yep.
And then the other thing I was thinking about, just from my impression of being in rural areas, is that this might have a big effect on air quality because the dust getting into the air is really unpleasant. So I don't know if that's something that your data work has already been incredible. So, but if you, it would just be interesting to think about other health effects.
Sure. Why don't I take a couple questions and then I'll answer them. There might be complementarities between them. Yeah.
There was complementarity in that I had 3 and that was one of them. I wondered if the employment reflects people working on the roads, maintaining the roads, et cetera, et cetera. The other 2 were, I think there's a lot of rich things you could do with the multiple discontinuities and with heterogeneous treatment effects. For example, you might expect a big town that doesn't have a road to be just different from a small town that doesn't have a road. If there's a big town that doesn't have a road, it must be that there's something else about it. It's particularly remote, it is a particularly disfavored ethnic group, et cetera.
Yep.
And you could do some really interesting things theoretically predicting what the differences at different discontinuities would be. Another rich area would be exploring why the late might differ from the ATE. That you could imagine, I mean, if there's a big, highly productive firm, the last thing it's going to do is locate in a town where there's no road. So you might expect, however, you might not expect big differences between the vegetable carts in towns with and without roads. And there is a reason why the firms whose access to a road is determined by this treatment, that is the complier group might differ quite a lot. The effect on the compliers might differ quite a lot from the effect on the population. And the last thing was I really wouldn't worry too much about the selection into treatment and failing the McCrary test and all of that. I wonder if you could just use the lagged population. If you have all this census data, except if there's a lot of entry and exit of the existence of villages, you should be able to just use the population 10 years ago, 20 years ago that they couldn't have selected for. It's going to be super highly correlated with today's population. And there could be no McCrary smoothness in that distribution, and the whole exercise would just go forward. Yep. And that problem isn't solved by just using the rank, because if you can manipulate your population, you can manipulate your rank too.
Great. Let me answer these questions or address these issues, and then take 1 or 2 more if we have the time for it. So part of other programs, that's a really good point, and particularly I think when we use the rank, we're kind of sensitive to that issue, because a lot of programs are going to be using district rank and kind of going down lists in one way or another. The PMGSY is not part of NREGA or these other programs. They do, in the later years, start to use some of the states' implemented programs on their own, actually, which were like state rural road programs, in addition to the Prime Minister's ones for smaller villages that do use local labor and try to dovetail with NREGA, but this program doesn't. And in fact hires contractors in a way that's banned by NREGA and is very capital intensive and kind of building roads at best practices. But that said, the correlation with other sort of programs going on in the 2000s, it's a good point, and one of the things we're looking into is this electrification scheme to see whether treatment in this program and that one are in fact correlated. Air quality, not going to have variation at the level that air quality is measured. Air quality measures are much cruder in India. That's why, we're sort of stuck with the village level measures, and we're sort of proud of ourselves for the number of village level measures that we do in fact have, but to some extent we're stuck with these. You don't get variation as you go up to a higher level, because the variation really is at the village level. So people working on the roads, we don't think so. We're looking only after the road has been completed. And there is work to do on roads. It's generally multiple years afterwards, the way this program is sort of set up, and we're seeing results pretty quickly. So And these are contractors that are often bringing in a bunch of their own guys, and it's very capital intensive. So we don't think it would account for it, but it's something to think harder about for sure. Totally agree with you on multiple discontinuities. We really want to get into this. It's nice to have jumps at two very different population points. As you suggested, we need to think hard about what the local average treatment effect means here, because the population of 1,000-person villages that don't have roads is quite different from the population of 500-person villages that don't have roads already, right? And so they're going to be, we do in fact find them more remote and sort of less well off, even though they're larger in some ways, less well off relative to what we think they might be. In terms of which population use we're using, actually as we take this forward, we found that when we're very careful with the data, the 2001 population census we can use rather than these habitation measures. And so it gets us around all of this sort of issue. And that's the reason why we had to go into habitations is because actually habitations in villages are slightly different in India, and this program chose to use habitations. It's one of the very few that does. Everything else, most other things use villages or even going up to a different level, which is called panchayat. So I think we're just coming out of the woods on all of this stuff. I mostly keep the big jumps in the density of population around those cutoffs, just to show like how careful you have to be with the data when using this. And there is some research on this program and some others that just use program data, and I think you need to be very, very careful with official program data when you're going to be using it for the basis of your instrument, because there are a lot of reasons why that might be manipulated.
It would be even more interesting if you could show the degree to which your results would be biased had you just...
So that will be... Totally. That is going to be something that we're going to be doing. And in fact, another paper that might spin off of this is trying to understand, well, who's able to manipulate? Who is it who's able to take advantage of these program rules and who isn't, to try to understand a bit of... everyone's interested in getting a road. Everyone's probably interested in reporting higher population in order to do that. But what are the characteristics of locations that are actually able to take advantage of this? So I think we're probably out of time. So thank you very much for your feedback, and happy to talk more later.
So could you please? Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Okay, so this would be the last presentation for this session, and with this we would be shifting the focus to a little bit about the skill formation and that's impact on labor market outcomes. This is done in collaboration with my co-author Chiming Tan from University of North Dakota. So, as you probably know by now, ability and skill formation has been well studied and understood, estimated in the economics literature. What we know is that different stages of life cycle are important to forming different types of skills, and attributes or skills formed in childhood could have lasting impacts on or could be determining adult outcomes. So speaking of ability in detail, there are two types of abilities that we mostly concentrate on. First is the cognitive ability, which is typically measured by IQ or G factor, and in terms of availability of data, this used to be more available for developed countries, but it's increasingly becoming popular in developing countries as well. The other type of ability that we economists are concerned about is the non-cognitive ability. If you've read anything that reads James Heckman recently, then you would probably know what I'm talking about. So what do economists mean by non-cognitive ability? Well, mostly it's the big 5 factors. To be more clear, openness to experience, agreeableness, neuroticism, sometimes used with the acronym called OCEAN. So I should probably tell you that in psychology, everything that needs brain functioning is cognitive. So there's no such thing as non-cognitive abilities. What we economists determine or identify as non-cognitive is usually called personality traits. So things like OCEAN are regarded as personality traits in psychology. The problem with these personality traits is that there is not a whole lot of consensus among or theoretical backup for these personality traits. So what we propose is moving the discussion about non-cognitive ability a little bit away from personality traits into something that is much more theoretically developed, called the executive function. Executive function is a set of mental processes. It helps an individual connect past experience with present action. So unlike personality traits, executive function is well defined and researched in psychology. It is also well measured and it has real, reliable, valid implications within the clinical sciences. Let me give you an example. Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders identifies ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactive Disorder, therefore a clinically defined disorder, as a deficiency of executive function. So, in order to be more elaborate about this, executive function essentially includes attention, distractibility, impulsivity, hyperactivity, and complex processes such as planning, organizing, and task completion. In short, executive function allows a person to pursue goal-directed behavior, which is why we think it will be a good predictor of economic activity. So, in this paper, we propose a proxy measure for the executive function, and we interpret this measure as a measure of sustained attention, because the psychological process most likely to underlie both emotion regulation and executive function is attention. So we ask these questions: if a person is endowed with high sustained attention, would they be earning more income? Would they be doing better jobs? Or would they be getting more schooling as a result? And let me give you a preview of what we see. We find suggestive evidence that yes, they tend to earn more. They tend to be employed in white collar jobs as opposed to blue collar jobs, and they tend to have more schooling as a result as well. So I will talk more about the findings later on. Let me talk about the data that allows us to do this analysis. We use two cross-sectional waves from Ghana Living Standards Survey and Ghana Education Impact Evaluation Survey. In both these surveys, we have respondents who are 9 to 55 years old, and we have information regarding their demographics, wages, and of course occupational choices. More importantly for us, we have a specific measure of their cognitive ability, which is measured through the Raven's progressive matrices, or commonly known as the IQ score. And for the proxy measure for the non-cognitive ability, we use achievement test scores. So let me explain a little bit more about what we mean by this achievement test scores. Every respondent in our these two cross sections who had 3 or more years of schooling were given a simple math and an English test, and if they performed better, or if they scored more than 50% in the simple math and English test, they got the advanced versions of those tests. So before I go into any further details, let me actually show you what these simple and advanced tests look like. Here is a simple test. It had 8 questions, the 8 that you see here. The simple math, and this is the sample of advanced math test. This test had 36 multiple choice questions which are of this nature. So my question to you, do you think the advanced test is actually harder than the simple test? Good. We hope so too, because that's what gives us identification when we are creating our proxy measure for sustained attention. So let me be more clear here. We look at everybody who took the advanced test. Like I showed you, the advanced test only had multiple choice questions. So there could be the possibility that somebody just blatantly guessed what the correct answers are, right? So we calculate the number of answers they would have got right had they been just blatantly guessing. Then we look at the actual score that people got. So if the actual score, what I mean by average is the average over English and math, because both were given. So if a person got an average advanced test score which is greater than the random guessing test score, we identify those individuals as high cognitive ability, emphasis on cognitive ability here, high cognitive ability or the smart people. So smart essentially is a binary variable. Okay. Then we look at the smart people, everybody who got a value of 1 in the smart category. We look at their simple test scores. Like I showed you earlier, the simple test in fact was quite simple. So if you are a smart person, categorized as follows, then completing the simple test must have been quite easy for you. In fact, getting a perfect score should not have been that difficult because you clearly had the aptitude. But if you did not get the perfect score, that doesn't mean that you didn't know how to do this math, the sums, but it was rather something else was missing, which is what we identify as the lack of non-cognitive ability. So let me just summarize everything we do here using these equations. We look at smart category, smart meaning they scored better than random guessing in the advanced test. Then we look at how they fared in the simple test scores. If they got a perfect score for the simple test, that is all the 8 answers are correct in the simple test, we identify that as a person who is endowed with high sustained attention or executive function equals 1. A person who does not get a full score for the simple test would be endowed with low sustained attention. So the way we defined the treatment variable, which is the sustained attention, is a binary variable. Therefore, we can define the average treatment effect of the treated as follows. Now here we use matching estimations which would allow us to pair a high treatment group or a high sustained attention individual with 1 or more respondents in the control group who would have similar other covariate values. Then, so we use a whole host of estimation strategies and we do matching with replacement because our data simply does not allow us to do without replacement. It needs much bigger data, which we don't have. So we do all these kinds of different matching strategies, and if you recall, like Ervin pointed out in the first presentation, the IPW and IPW-RA would have the double robust property. So this essentially is a robustness check as well to see how consistent our results are across, and today I will be showing you results for all these different estimation techniques, matching techniques. And here's our empirical model. I'm going to show you 3 results, 3 sets of results. The paper has more. Essentially for log annual income, we do not look at the wages because this is Ghana. Agriculture is quite prevalent and so is self-employment. So we look at all the forms in which an individual could have been paid over the course of the year. So we look at the annual income. By occupational choices, we have, it's a binary variable, 1 for white if you are employed in a white collar job and 0 for blue collar jobs. And then a number of years completed. Executive function, like I showed in the slide a couple of slides ago, is a binary variable again. 1 if a person has high sustained attention, defined the way we did, and 0 otherwise. Then we have a whole host of covariates that we find in the literature that are also available in our data set. In the interest of time, I'd rather not go into detail, but I'm very happy to take questions and discuss more about the other covariates that we have in our study. So in terms of descriptive statistics, we see that matching actually takes care of the covariate balance for a greater extent, but there are some variables which are still imbalanced. For example, age. Our treatment group is statistically older than the control group, which there's nothing that we could do about it because by the nature of our sample size actually. However, we do robustness checks with the other variable, without the other variables, just to see whether our results are consistent, and I'm going to talk more about it when I get to the robustness part of this discussion. So let me hold on the discussion until then. First, let me show what we see. Great, thanks. So here are the results for the log annual income regressions. Our sample is strictly older than 15 years, which is the legal age of working in Ghana. And as you can see, all across the different matching techniques, we see that a person who is having high sustained attention is about 33% would be earning about 33% more income than a person with low sustained attention. So what we find also interesting is that when we move on to the white collar regressions, the occupational choice, we see that the high sustained attention individuals are likely to be about 13% more likely to be engaged in, employed in a white collar job as opposed to a blue collar job. And actually something I should have mentioned in previous results is that we see for the most part qualitatively and quantitatively similar results across different estimation techniques. Here the propensity score matching technique, we don't observe significant results, but the other ones are, and quantitatively they are quite similar. The magnitudes are similar. Then we have the educational attainment. Now here this is, we don't want to deal with endogeneity, so we restrict our sample to be strictly older than 25 years, which is a threshold by which most of the respondents have completed schooling. And if I interpret these results, we see having high sustained attention, an individual is likely to complete about 8 more months of schooling. So the magnitudes may not be really great, but we see a positive impact of having high sustained attention for an individual. Now let me talk about the robustness checks. Do I have time? Okay, great. This is the final thing that I want to mention. We conduct 2 different types of robustness checks. First, related to the specification. Like I mentioned here, we have imbalance in terms of treatment, age in our treatment and control groups, but we try the specifications without cognitive ability, parents' education and school quality variables, and we try another specification with only age, gender and locality, which we assume to be predetermined pre-treatment variables, and we find that our results are robust to all these different specifications. The other kind of robustness check that we implement is, I didn't get to talk more about it, that is, even though a person scored better than, more than 50% in the simple test, when they were given the advanced test, they could have just simply said no, there was no reason for them to take the test, or maybe they were not at the household when the test was given. So there could be any number of reasons why a person did not take the advanced test, therefore they are not in our sample at all, because we only look at the SMART category. So there could be some sort of a selection into advanced tests. So what we do is we impute, but the thing is we know who is eligible to take the advanced test and who did take and who did not. So those who are eligible to take the test but didn't, we impute a value of 0. In essence, we are expanding our control group to see whether taking the people who did not take the test seem to be systematically different. And we see that actually we do much more falsification tests along the same lines, and we see that the results that we observe are robust and consistent across the specifications and cohorts. So in conclusion, okay, great. In conclusion, what I would like to say is that direct measures for non-cognitive ability, especially in the context of a developing country, is not that easy to come by. So what we propose is using a theoretically well-defined executive function as a way of measuring the non-cognitive ability. And we do that by creating a proxy measure using the avoidable mistakes that the high cognitive or the SMART respondents made on a simple achievement test. And we use regression, matching and propensity score weighing approaches. And after conducting some robustness checks and falsification exercises, we see suggestive evidence that having sustained attention would result in an individual earning approximately 32% more annual income. There's also some evidence that they are more likely to be engaged in white-collar jobs and have more months of education, completed education. And that's it. Thank you for your attention. Thanks.
is off now.
Yes, let me write it down.
Okay, hopefully this is the right one. Great. Well, thank you very much, Dhanushka, for that. That was, I enjoyed reading the paper, and certainly it's an interesting and important topic. It's been, as you said, Heckman's been doing a ton of research in this area, and people are just sort of waking up to how important these non-cognitive abilities may in fact be. And I think we can probably all think in our lives and think that if we had a little bit more of these abilities, we'd be a bit better off. So just to do a quick summary, what she's doing here is estimating the effect of non-cognitive skills on various economic outcomes. We have 3 primary economic outcomes, which is earnings, education, and the type of job, whether you work in a white-collar job or not. The treatment is your performance on a simple test, conditional on an above-random score on the advanced test. So how well did you do on a more basic set of questions? And what they find is that this high score on the simple test, what they're calling sustained attention individuals, earn more, get more education, are more likely to work in white-collar jobs, even when controlling for cognitive ability. So I think it's a really creative idea to try to use the score on a sort of simpler test to try to measure something different from what's being measured on the advanced test. That said, that is in fact a test that's designed to measure cognitive ability.
Right.
Both of them are tests that are designed to measure cognitive ability. And what your core assumption is here is that after knowing your performance on the advanced test, your performance on the non-advanced test is sort of purely, were you paying attention to these questions or not? These were so much simpler than the questions on the advanced test, and knowing that you did well on the advanced test means that anything you got wrong on the simple test is because of these sort of non-cognitive skills, your attention to detail in some sense, rather than your pure ability to do it, whatever that means, right? That's a very, very strong assumption. And I think that this paper would be considerably stronger if you're able to really convince us more that that's a valid assumption.
I see.
An alternate assumption is that, and I think the one that's most natural, at least to me, is that both of these tests are in fact measures of both cognitive ability, non-cognitive ability, and luck, right? And so your score for individual I on test J, and that could be either basic or advanced, is some combination of, and this is just linear, but there's no reason why it would be, cognitive, non-cognitive, and some error term. And we think there's actually quite a large component of noise in this because these are multiple choice questions. And I'm proud to say that I once got 0 out of 10 true and false questions right on a history test in high school. So we know that there's a considerable component of luck in any sort of questions like this. And so in this sort of simple model, each of these, and maybe in different ways, are picking up both cognitive and non-cognitive. And so scoring highly on the latter test could mean that you were considerably lucky on the later test. And so any difference between the two is actually a meaningful signal of both your cognitive and non-cognitive abilities, right? It's hard to know what to do with this. This is not about your specification per se. It's not about an additional robustness check. It's kind of key to our interpretation of the results in the basic test. One thing that you can do is up the threshold considerably. So the threshold right now is, did you do better than random? But we think a lot of people are going to do better than random for purely random reasons.
Right.
And so you want to have a quite high threshold so that we're really convinced that we have very high cognitive ability people, so that the non-cognitive test really is perhaps an indicator of non-cognitive ability. So I would like to see robustness to much, much higher thresholds than you're scoring right now. But I think that this is one of those papers that would really benefit from even a very simple model of how do you perform on these two tests, and sort of what are the assumptions that you're making about the information that's captured in the basic test. Because I'm seeing 2 signals of ability across a range of characteristics, and of course the second signal is meaningful because the first signal is noisy. Right? And so you're kind of assuming that the second signal isn't noisy and perfectly answers the question of cognitive ability, which I think is probably not right. So putting aside those concerns, we also want to think about, is your estimate causal? you kind of want to go from non-cognitive ability to higher economic outcomes, right? But I think we could just as easily say that you could go the other way around. People who work in a white-collar job for whatever reason are used to sustained attention to boring documents and, you know, all kinds of other non-cognitive skills that are built from having a white-collar job. It's a very different experience from a blue-collar job. Likewise, if you earn more money, we know that you're less stressed, and an increasing behavioral literature is showing that these things can have real effects on your cognitive performance. So see some of the work by Sendel Mullainathan on that. And so one thing that's sort of imperfect, but what you can do is put some of these outcomes on the right-hand side. So let's estimate earnings, putting job type and schooling on the right-hand side to say, okay, well, within these groups, does this predict sort of higher earnings? And that may be a way of at least controlling for whatever shift in non-cognitive abilities might be coming from actually having more years of schooling or having a white-collar job. And I don't think your robustness checks are addressing these particular concerns right now. And that's really it. Otherwise, I really enjoyed reading it, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the, I hope this is working. Okay. So thank you very much for the insights, Sam. And yes, I agree with you that we make a very strong assumption that getting the perfect score means that you were paying attention. So just like your history class, I got a perfect score for my history of economics thought, and I know better, you know. So multiple choice isn't really the best way of judging a person's attention or even maybe aptitude to a certain extent. So yeah, that's a big assumption, and we should, in terms of convincing people more, so right now we are kind of riding on the fact that we have the direct measure for the cognitive, so we put that in and we still capture something, but I agree with you that we could do a better job at actually convincing this is exactly what we mean it to be. And thank you for the very refreshing suggestion that we could maybe up the threshold a little bit more than just random guessing. We could actually look at the distribution and maybe pick up a couple of other thresholds, and at worst, it could be just, you know, like some randomness check, robustness checks for what we already see. We could see if the results still persist. So that's a very good suggestion. And in terms of reverse causality, especially with the white collar, the occupational choice, we actually have cut it in different ways, but I agree that perhaps we could let education play a little bit bigger role in this story, and we have not, right now we have these big groups of white collar and blue collar. Perhaps we could see within white collar what kind of, you know, variation we see, and I'm kind of thinking off the top of my head like what more we could do with the variation in the occupational choices that we have, because we do have quite a bit of variation. So thank you for the suggestion. So yeah. Questions? Yes, right behind you.
Well, thank you for the presentation. My question is about the cognitive ability and the non-cognitive ability and the relationship to the executive function. I guess these are three things that are highly correlated. How much, if you just do a regression of the income on these things, how much this executive function takes away from the correlation with the income? So this is my first question. And my second point is more a remark. Well, the reason why Heckman has this agenda on personal traits is that this is something that you can make intervention on to improve the outcome of an individual. And it seems that one thing that's interesting with sustained attention is that this is something that you can improve with people. Maybe you want to stress that a little bit when you do your presentation.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I'd like to actually answer that question right away. So actually in the in the literature that is separating the cognitive and non-cognitive abilities, we see there is evidence that non-cognitive abilities could lead to higher cognitive ability, but not the other way around. We do not essentially test for this or use this information, but I just know that there are some papers that does so, they are very interrelated. But the thing is, actually this is related to the second point that you made. We know that cognitive abilities, things like IQ, they are formed at a pretty early age, but 8 to 10 years old. But the thing about non-cognitive ability is that they are more susceptible. They could be cultivated in people, which is why it's a great for policy instruments and such. So in terms of connecting this to attention, so I agree with you that if the results hold, that would be a great way of encouraging, especially the youth, even if they are not endowed with huge or real great cognition, there could be some ways they could still recover as they grow up and go into the labor force. So we actually mention in the paper, we go into a little bit of detail of describing why executive function could be a good measure, but perhaps I wasn't very clear. So I just wanted to make sure that rather than concentrating only on the personality traits, and I mean if you have specific measures for personality traits, that could still be a valid thing to do. But if you do not, then these are very subjective things to begin with. Executive function, on the other hand, it has a good theoretical backing, so which is what we would want to emphasize. So.
My point is that it's not just a measure, it's a target.
Right.
Well, your presentation makes it a little weird because my sister now have very little sustainability. Because they want to go and do that.
Right.
Watch TV and have earphones.
Yeah.
So I think it might be a variable that
Yes, that I absolutely agree, because attention is, sometimes it's hard to come by, so yes, I agree. Yes, you have a question?
So since it's sustained attention, do you have, are you using any variation within the order of questions?
Within
The order of questions, right? Because if I really have a problem of inattention, so I would get probably the first questions right, maybe not the later ones.
Oh, I see. No, I mean right now as it is, we only look at how much.
See, that'd be convincing because they're equally hard or equally simple, in fact.
Right.
So if I really only mess up the last ones and not the first ones, then it's probably something has more to do with me system.
That's a neat idea, because no, I have not looked at how much they have, how they fared in each question. I take the aggregate. Yes, so that could definitely be something that I could look more into and see if I see any clear patterns in terms of, because I mean, if you really think about it, if somebody just did the math test, so difference between getting 7 right and 8 right is very, very marginal. I mean, like in our case, we would have somebody who got all 8 questions right as somebody with high sustained attention and 0 otherwise. So in that case, I agree that having little bit more, I guess, insight onto which questions they actually got wrong might actually, I think that would help us make a stronger case.
And also maybe just a suggestion is that if you were able to replicate this kind of methodology on a setting that you entirely control in a lab in the university, it'd be interesting to compare the results.
Right. As a controlled experiment.
Well, have better the measurements you think would be best to capture this, but also do this imperfect measurement that you have from this data.
Right.
And compare the two and see whether they really correlate well. That's just another, out of sample.
Right. Yes, I agree. Yeah, thank you. Yes?
Thank you for the presentation. My question is on your outcome variables. Some seem to be too fit to be also independent variables in some other, for instance, education, and then employment. Education, if left out in the employment equation, you could have this spurious regression where the sustained attention, education affects that.
Right.
And then it also affects employment. So I was wondering, leaving out these variables that fit to be independent variables. So I was even wondering whether you could adapt a different specifications that are for simultaneous, you cater for the standard errors if they are correlated across the three equations. You could have models that cater for that, like you have three simultaneous equations, and then you have these entering different specifications as independent variables.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion, because as it is right now, you're right, we do not want to kind of have it, because we do not put it because we don't want to deal with the endogeneity issues. So we treat education separately. We take a whole different sample for that who are strictly over 25 years, so we know that they have completed schooling by then. Then we look at the earnings or income. We do not essentially put it. So yes, maybe a different way of looking at would be estimating all three simultaneously, like you suggest, which is something we have not done, but that would be something interesting to look at. And I think it's little related to what Sam said earlier also about categorizing into different occupational groups and talking about what happens within that group, which is, I think, is something doable. So, yeah. Okay, thank you so very much. See you around. Sam, can I take your slides?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thanks.